Well, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm Sarah Krotz, the Interim Director of the Canadian Literature Centre, and I'm speaking to you from the University of Alberta on Treaty 6 territory and Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta in Edmonton, known to many as Amiskwaci-Waskagan, which has long been an important gathering place for diverse Indigenous nations. And as I appreciate where I am today, I'm also really grateful that we can gather online. I see many of you joining us from different places across the country. And just want to say that it's lovely to connect in this way, especially in November when we all need a bit of an intellectual boost. So the CLC's Scholarly Lecture Series gives us a chance to be energized by new research and thinking that enriches our sense of Canada's literary cultures, their scope, their reach, their politics. And I'm thrilled today to introduce this year's scholarly lecture by Dr. Jody Mason, who is an associate professor in the Department of English at Carleton University, cross-appointed with the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies. Mason is the author of 2 books, Writing Unemployment, Worklessness, Mobility, and Citizenship in 20th-Century Canadian Literatures, published by U of T in 2013, and Home Feelings, Liberal Citizenship and the Canadian Reading Camp Movement, published by McGill-Queen in 2019, and the winner of the Gabrielle Roy Prize. Mason is currently undertaking SSHRC-funded research for a 3rd book project that examines Canadian practices of book diplomacy and uses of books as foreign aid in the last half of the 20th century. Jody, it is such an honor to have you come share some of this project with us. Welcome.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. So I'm just going to share my screen to begin. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the people of Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, who are the custodians of the lands and waters on and near which I live and work in Chautaga, Montreal. And thank you to Sarah Krotz. I'm grateful that you were open to the idea of this talk, and also for the work you're doing for the CLC, and to Austin Lee for her help with all the details. And thanks to all of you for coming. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes. So just to give you a sort of sense of how long this will be. The title of the paper is The Creative Crusade, Settler Colonial Antinomies, and Books for Development in the Age of 3 Worlds. So the period from the late 1950s to the mid-1970s is widely identified with an increase in the number of Canadian authored English language literary trade books published in Canada. Roy McSkimming's account of Canadian publishing in the second half of the 20th century offers a way of looking at this boom that is less domestically focused than the standard narrative, which attributes the expansion of this expansion to state sponsorship of books, authors, and to a lesser extent to publishers. He rehearses a conversation that he once had with Dave Godfrey, founder with Dennis Lee of House of Anansi Press, a Toronto small press that contributed many Canadian authored books to the publishing explosion of the 60s and early 70s. McSkimming writes, in Cape Coast, Ghana, Godfrey had visited a man of very limited means who printed his own books and bound them himself by hand. If that guy could be a publisher, Godfrey insisted, we all could. Like hundreds of other Canadians of his generation who were compelled by the transformation promised by the UN designated development decades, the 1960s and then the 1970s, Godfrey was in Ghana in the 1960s as a student volunteer with the Canadian University Service Overseas, CUSO, the non-governmental organization founded in 1961. Godfrey taught literature at an Anglican high school for boys, but also eventually established a night school class for working men in a town in proximity to his assignment, an experience that, in Nick Mount's words, quote, taught him to reject feelings of colonial inadequacy and look to his own culture for inspiration. After returning to Toronto, Godfrey partnered with fellow academic and creative writer Dennis Lee in 1967 to found, with some modest assistance from the Canada Council, House of Anansi Press, well known to all of you, I'm sure. And in naming the company as they did, after the West African trickster associated with stories and knowledge, Lee and Godfrey materialized their debt to the example of the resourceful Ghanaian publisher. Just as the paperback revolution and the larger international expansion of the book trade in the decades following the Second World War formed part of the global substrate of what has been called the CanLit boom, so this period's conjoining of books to the new concept of international development forms part of the story we might tell about this boom. We might probe the complex and shifting settler colonial identifications of this period by looking at the history of development assistance, which brought books, key elements of the cultures of New Left and sovereigntist nationalisms, together with development in actions that framed Canada as a successful model of modernization and decolonization. This paper analyzes a particular Canadian non-governmental book development program to show how its work from the late 1950s to the end of the 1970s was imbricated in neo-colonial practices beyond Canada's own borders. The contradictions of book development offer a view of the complexity of settler colonial nation-making during the 3 decades that followed the close of the Second World War. Non-governmental book development programs, such as the Overseas Book Centre Centre de Livres pour Outre-mer, were enmeshed in a voluntary internationalism that depended on rhetorical representations of Canada as unique from European nations because of its recent history as a colony. The implication of such arguments was that Canada was at the same time set apart from the United States, which was remaking the old mantle of imperialism for the post-war world. At the same time, and in concert with what was coming to be called by 1950 development, this voluntary internationalism perpetuated neo-colonial economic systems that failed to nourish, and in some cases even actively undermined, local production capacities, especially as these related to publishing. If the colonial practice of book dumping, the process by which British and American books were dumped into the Canadian market in contravention of copyright agreements, was a significant inhibitor to the establishment of original Canadian publishing during the 19th and 20th centuries, and was widely condemned by Canadian publishers, this practice, renamed and cast in the very different ideological light of development for the Third World, was central to the work of the OBC between the 1950s and the end of the 1970s. So many of the Canadians promoting liberal internationalist ideals in the 1940s could be found in the country's robust education movement. A noted liberal internationalist affiliated with the adult education movement in the post-war years was James Robbins Kidd, known as Roby Kidd, director from 1950 to 1960 of the Canadian Association for Adult Education and promoter of adult education in a wide array of the era's national and international cultural and educational organizations, many of which he founded, including the Canadian Film Institute, the Canadian Citizenship Council, Frontier College, the Bon Echo Foundation, the Overseas Institute of Canada, UNESCO's Adult Education Committee, and the International Council for Adult Education. He was a tireless individual, Roby Kidd. Raised a Baptist in both British Columbia and Saskatchewan, Kidd observes in his memoir that the many talks given by returned missionaries he listened to as a young person programmed him for life in international development work. As one of the first Canadians to earn a doctorate in adult education from Columbia University, Kidd was uniquely prepared to lead the post-war organizations that placed adult education at the center of emerging ideas about development. In the late 1950s, Kidd became involved in a project called the Overseas Book Centre, a manifestation of his belief that Canada had a particular international contribution to make to what he called fundamental education and community development. The OBC was co-founded in 1959 by Kidd, Harry Campbell, Marian Mcfarland, and Kurt Swinton. All born during or immediately after the First World War, Kidd's co-founders had similar, though slightly less populated records of civic engagement and commitments to liberal internationalism. Harry Campbell, for example, had served as archivist for the UN in New York during the Second World War, and then as a librarian for UNESCO before returning to Toronto to become that city's chief librarian in its public library system from 1956 to 1978. Marian Mcfarland, about whom I've discovered little, was a Canadian Adult Education, Canadian Association for Adult Education member and a member of the United Nations Association. Kurt Swinton was at the time of the OBC's founding president of Encyclopedia Britannica Canada and served throughout his adult life in a variety of domestic and international associations committed to internationalism, including the United Nations Association, the Kuching Institute of Public Affairs, the International Council for Adult Education, and the Canadian Institute for International Affairs. Swinton was also apparently eventually an advisor to CEDA. The OBC had Canadian precedents in non-governmental undertakings, the OBC had Canadian precedents in non-governmental undertakings like the Canadian Council for Reconstruction through UNESCO and other book donation campaigns that responded in the wake of the Second World War to the call for reconstruction. However, in using books as instruments to support international education and what was coming to be called development, the OBC would not, like its predecessors, aim at Europe. They set their sights instead on the nations of what was coming to be known as the developing world. The OBC was committed to the idea that wealthy nations like Canada could, as one organizational history puts it, help education in the third world through the presentation of books. The OBC flagship program, Books for Developing Countries, had, according to Harry Campbell, one of the founders, a second purpose: to provide a use for the surplus books from Toronto libraries and Britannica that would otherwise have been burned or shredded. Though the OBC also received donated books through the period of its Books for Developing Countries program, donated books from publishers, schools, colleges, professional groups, individuals. It took donations from all sorts of places eventually. Initially, the OBC operated from space supplied by Kurt Swinton in an Encyclopedia Britannica warehouse in Toronto, where volunteers collected and packed books for shipment. The Saguenay Shipping Company agreed to transport books free of charge to the Caribbean, and other shipping companies later contributed free or low-cost transport. As historians of NGOs have argued, the NGO emerged hand in hand with development, the concept, along with third world, modernization, and related keywords that was so important to the US-dominated post-war decade. Although NGOs were in existence prior to the 1950s, the United Nations designation of the first development decade in 1961 added further urgency to the development idea, making the 1960s, in Ruth Compton Brewer's words, a decisive decade for the expansion, transplanting, and creation of development-focused NGOs. Canada saw the emergence in this decade of groups such as the Mennonite Central Committee, Oxfam Canada, and CUSO, this last established in the same year, 1961, as the Peace Corps in the United States. While Compton Brewer argues that CUSO was the first Canadian NGO to undertake development work from a, quote, secular stance and in a context of rapid decolonization, the OBC could similarly qualify under this definition, and it was founded 2 years earlier. Though the OBC was unique in Canada at its inception, it was part of the broader emergence during the late 1950s and early 1960s of book development initiatives undertaken by the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, Germany, and other industrialized nations, and that included state as well as non-governmental organizations and private foundations. You might think here of America's Ford Foundation or Franklin Publications. As book historians like Greg Barnheisel have shown, the book was deeply implicated in the Cold War of ideas that accompanied what Michael Dunning has called the Age of Three Worlds, a triangulation of the capitalist first world, the communist second world, and the decolonizing third world. The thinking that conjoined books and development in these decades was not new. As Joseph Slaughter points out, it drew on a common assumption about the role of literacy as a link between the material that is socioeconomic and spiritual, cognitive, epistemic aspects of modernization that reflects a modern democratic orthodoxy about the benefits and effects of reading and writing that coalesced over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Taken up as it was in the post-war institutions of liberal internationalism, the technology of literacy, particularly in the artifactual form of the book, became something of a fetish within certain humanitarian strains of development discourse and human rights. That's Slaughter. So Slaughter locates these strands in the US-backed modernization imperatives of the decades following the Second World War, which influenced American foreign aid initiatives such as the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, established in 1961, as well as the UN and UNESCO. You can note here that Slaughter's analysis doesn't really tell the whole story because American publishers, Curtis Benjamin, for example, were acknowledging in this period that books and technologies used to make them could also serve as levers to open new markets to US investment. So there's a whole other story of from the American point of view of opening markets that's important to the history of development and book development, maybe more particularly in this period. This is one of the points that Sarah Briette makes in her reading of UNESCO, which I found very helpful alongside other historians of UNESCO. Like other mid-century NGOs, the OBC initiative issued from, even as it interrogated, a concept of development that's particular to the decade that followed the Second World War. Development appeared as a policy field in the late 1940s and early 1950s and became a crucial piece of the liberal internationalism of the UN and its agencies. The emerging political and economic dominance of the United States is important to this history, as were the efforts of European powers to maintain their colonies in the post-war era. Karina Unger maps the factors contributing to the latter relationship: food and other kinds of resource scarcity in both colonies and metropoles during the war, as well as labor agitation and political unrest, such as the Quit India movement, served by the end of the conflict to press European powers into promises of reform. This reorientation of the concept of development, what Frederick Cooper has called modernizing imperialism or developmental colonialism, hinged on elementary welfare provisions, particularly for the many soldiers from the colonies who served in European armies, and significant European increases in development funds. This period of late colonial development, armed as it was with a new actor to the stage, the UN and its agencies, did, according to Unger, help to establish development measures as progressive and forward-looking activities, especially against the background of war and destruction. This is perhaps particularly true for development initiatives associated with education and books. In the early 1960s, as Roby Kidd's involvement in the international development efforts of the era ramped up, the OBC was brought under the aegis of the Overseas Institute of Canada, an organization he founded in 1962 as a means of supporting the creation of a Canadian plan for international development. The work of the OBC and more broadly the Overseas Institute of Canada during the 1960s occurred in the context of a more general expansion of federal commitments to foreign aid. At the time of his election in 1963, Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson was strongly identified with the foreign aid file because of his work, of course, on the Colombo Plan and his tenure as both Undersecretary and then Secretary of State for External Affairs, and with liberal internationalism more generally. During the Pearson years, 63 to 68, when Paul Martin was Secretary of State for External Affairs, Canada's foreign aid tripled in terms of dollar amounts and expanded its geographic reach, so to the Caribbean, to French Africa, to Latin America. But it also experienced significant reorganization as the External Aid Office in External Affairs was granted the capacity to develop policy and engage in analysis, advocacy, and outreach. With the creation of CEDA in 1968, the importance of the foreign aid file was further confirmed. The Pearson government also engaged the United Nations First Development Decade campaign through the 1960s in multiple ways, including a new foreign aid target, 1% of GNP, and a Canadian conference for the UN International Cooperation Year. And Kidd served as president of that conference. He was kind of everywhere, Kidd, in any Canadian effort focused on international development or education in these years. During the 1960s, Kidd urged audiences, Canadian audiences, such as the one gathered at the opening of the Don Mills Public Library in 1964, to view books not simply as aids to development, but as the most important development tool available. I realize now, having made these slides, that when you have the column, the right-hand column of faces on the right, you probably can't read all the text on the slide, but anyway, I'm going to read it for you. We have much to share with our brothers overseas, but nothing, not even bread itself, is more needed by them than books. It's a sobering experience to see, as I have seen, a class of men and women learning to read and write without any paper and forced to write with a pointed stick on sand. Think about that as you look at our disposal cans full of discarded newsprint on a Monday morning. It is almost unbearable to watch, as I have seen, a library van pull into a village in the Caribbean or Africa or Asia to observe every book taken down from the shelves, and yet some of the eager children or adults still go without. So as Kidd noted to his audience in the same talk, the OBC had sent about 1 million books to approximately 40 countries during 1964, and as he hoped, with planning and some assistance with money and time, could send another 1 million during 1965, the year of international cooperation, and indeed the OBC did meet that goal. In other speeches from the early 1960s, Kidd revised post-war arguments that had been made by English Canadian elites, such as Vincent Massey, regarding Canada's important role in what Massey called the contemporary Commonwealth. And this is a phrase Massey uses in his 1948 book On Being Canadian, emphasizing the unique role that Canada could play in the UN's development decade, and more particularly in the continuing education that he saw as basic to development. Kidd cast Canada's historical relationship to the British Empire in a very different light than Massey. In a 1961 address, Kidd frames Canada, a nation dependent on its international associations, as poised to lead what he called the new creative crusade. The nation's technological and scientific capacities are key to Kidd's argument, but more important is his emphasis on the nation's political status. Canada, he argues, is not perceived as a threat. Other people can accept aid from us without feeling demeaned or becoming fearful that this is the beginning of a new imperialism. Moreover, we ourselves have recently passed out of colonialism and are even now going through rapid industrialization. We seem to be nearer in our own development to what others want to do. This 1961 address echoes some of the rhetoric of Kidd's 1961 report, An International Development Plan for Canada, which insists that Canada has successfully emerged from a colonial position. It is even now going through rapid industrialization of the kind that other nations wish to emulate. The stage in national and economic development that we have reached gives assurance to new nations that they may be able to learn from us. Likewise, the size and scale of our life does not seem so overwhelming as does that of such nations as the United States or the Soviet Union. Such a moderate size and scale means that Canada is not perceived as a threat to anyone. Association with us or aid received from Canada will not be looked upon as a prelude to some economic form of imperialism or as an act in the Cold War. So such logic undergirds Kidd's idea of the nation's, quote, special mission. If there's anything in the doctrine of leadership by a middle power, if Canada does have a special mission among the nations, it is in international development that it will be best shown. So Kidd's view of Canada in the early 1960s was shaped then by the settler colonial conviction that the nation was not itself complicit in perpetuating colonizing practices. Such an assertion, of course, depends on the disavowal of ongoing colonial practices within 1960s Canada, such as the residential school system, but also the fact that the Commonwealth idea was based on a racialized hierarchy. As Dan Freeman Malloy contends, self-governing settler states such as Canada, Australia, and South Africa were imagined by the British to be, quote, operating on a different constitutional plane than Britain's colonial dependencies through most of the first half of the 20th century. A distinction that persisted after the Second World War in the rhetoric of the old and new Commonwealths, despite the fact, of course, that many of the new Commonwealth members, such as India, were amongst the oldest members of the British Empire. Freeman Malloy attributes this differential status to racialization, with white settler states experiencing different trajectories than brown and black colonial dependencies, even when the white settler population, as in the case of Southern Rhodesia, for example, was just a small minority. But in Kidd's framing, Canada, having recently set down the yoke of colonialism, could aid fellow decolonizing nations in the march to modernity. Instead of Massey's contemporary Commonwealth, Kidd was promoting a new internationalism that rejected unilateralism while also granting a special role to those settler colonial nations, such as Canada or Australia, that did not apparently wear the stain of imperialism. So Kidd's speeches from the early 1960s pinpointed education, and especially continuing education, which was really his passion, as the building block of development, suggesting that the nation's increasingly internationally recognized experiments in adult education had amply prepared its citizens to tackle international development. So this is a really important piece for Kidd because he was involved in what might be imagined as sort of grassroots literacy movements like Frontier College, and felt that Canada's experiments in this field were quite unique in the international context, and wanted to bring that to the world. So Kidd was deeply involved in these domestic experiments in adult education. So in addition to his work with a broad range of domestic adult education initiatives, he was increasingly involved from the 1960s forward in international adult education gatherings and organizations, including the 1960 UNESCO World Conference on Adult Education. He was conference president. UNESCO's Experimental World Literacy Program, which he chaired from 67 to 73, and eventually the International Council for Adult Education, which was founded in 1973. So Canada, through Kidd, in a way, played this kind of outsized role in the international movement for adult and continuing education in this period. In 1966, Kidd undertook for the Overseas Institute of Canada a 2-year study that examined how Canada might assist with the global campaign to eradicate illiteracy, the Experimental World Literacy Program, that UNESCO spearheaded at its 1965 World Conference of Ministers on the Eradication of Illiteracy, known as the Tehran Conference. Functional Literacy and International Development, published in 1968, was the result. So this report demonstrates that Kidd's rhetoric regarding Canada's proximity to and understanding of decolonizing nations was translated into action in this period, leading him to query US-supported concepts of development that he did not feel were in the best interest of those nations. Kidd and his Canadian research team were conducting their work in the particular context that were shaping UNESCO through the 1960s. The period of René Maru's leadership as Director General from 62 to 74 saw an increased commitment to education as a means of economic development. The US government and world-backed concept of functional literacy that proceeded from this ideology was the motor of the Experimental World Literacy Program, which delivered short-term vocational training to the vast majority of adult learners that it engaged. So there's a context here, which is that in the early 1960s, US and World Bank sort of suspicion of mass literacy campaign in Cuba, namely, leads them to move from an earlier idea of fundamental education to this concept of functional literacy, meant to oppose what was happening in Cuba. So Kidd and his team also employ this phrase functional literacy, but they clearly mean something different than the skills training promoted by Americans at UNESCO in this period. Pressing for an expanded conception of the adjective in the phrase, they dismiss out of hand the idea that these programs will amount to nothing more than the rapid acquisition of a few elementary skills, and instead outline a 3-stage program that would culminate in the lifelong pursuit of continuing education. In this sense, Kidd and his co-authors were anticipating the UNESCO critique of functional literacy that developed in the mid-70s during the Director Generalship of Amadou Mahtar Mobile. In short, Kidd was negotiating significant tensions in the development work he undertook and promoted through the 1960s. A consideration of his wider philosophy of adult education in the period illustrates the antinomies that subtended the work of the OBC during the 1960s and into the 1970s. In his writing from the 60s, Kidd was adamant that adult education programs in the developing world had to be built on local foundations. And in making these arguments, he frequently drew on the literatures of decolonizing nations, allowing writers from Caribbean or African nations to make the case for him, and thus instantiating the practice that he was recommending. Influenced by Philip Sherlock, director of extramural studies at the University College of West Indies, who was, in kids' words, searching out the artists of his own country to ensure that adult education would be warm and deeply penetrating. Kidd's 1958 study of adult education in the British West Indies argues that the best model was being constructed in the West Indies by West Indians and not in London or Chicago or Montreal. Other evaluations that Kidd went on to write in the 1960s echo this line of thinking. While functional literacy and economic development notes that locally relevant texts must be developed close to the communities in which instruction will be offered, it also contends, somewhat contradictorily, that organizations like the OBC were offering valuable donations of discarded textbooks and could do more of this work in the context of the Experimental World Literacy Program. This contradiction is particularly germane to the work of the OBC. Between 1960 and 75, the OBC shipped nearly 20 million books to 50 countries. So Kidd often presented libraries, librarians, and books as neutral and axiomatically positive tools. And quite at odds with his promotion of local knowledges and materials, he often suggested that any book from any place could lead to development in a poor nation. In his 1964 speech for the opening of the Don Mills Public Library, same one I quoted from before, Kidd quotes from South African writer Peter Abrahams from his 1954 memoir, Tell Freedom, in order to make just this point. In Kidd's framing, Abraham's narration of his youthful encounter with a white librarian leads him to school and then to a life of letters. Kidd's summary asks, who ever knows what a book will do, or a librarian? Yet Kidd gets some of the crucial details wrong here. In the scene that he quotes from, Abrahams is not in a library, but rather in the office of the smithy where he's employed as what Abrahams calls a colored child laborer. The office assistant, whom Abrahams identifies as a short-sighted Jewish girl, reads him Othello from Charles and Mary Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, an English children's book first published in 1807. This story enchants Abrahams and helps him resolve to attend school, despite the fact that education was not compulsory for Black or colored children like Abrahams during the 1930s, and regardless of the more pressing fact that he's a fatherless child whose mother and aunt depend on his wages from the smithy to survive. So Tell Freedom is about the problem of education in South Africa. Most of the primary education offered to Black and colored students in the interwar period was provided by Anglican missionaries. And though Abrahams offers a positive account of his encounter with this culture of schooling, he notes its disconnection from the society around it. It's figured as a peaceful valley that does not correspond with or engage the, quote, big world of a newly independent South Africa. The tools it offers are not ones that will allow Abrahams to change the racist and fundamentally unjust structure of South African society. His solution then is to leave South Africa for London at the end of the 1930s. Tell Freedom is not a story about the universally liberating power of books. It is about the misery that follows from an education system that's not an organic part of its society. What Kidd and the co-authors of a 1976 report on the Experimental World Literacy Program called the schoolhouse as an outpost of civilization, cut off from the reality around it. In this sense, Tell Freedom is about the limits of imported books as tools of development, and not a tale of the axiomatically positive value of all books. The anti-Vietnam War movement and decolonization movements of the late 1960s brought new energy and conflict to the field of foreign aid. In 1968, as the operations of the Overseas Institute of Canada expanded, the OIC, the Overseas Institute of Canada, and the OBC were separated to become, on the one hand, a council, the first umbrella organization for NGOs in Canada, and on the other, a practical program of overseas aid, the OBC. In the same year, CETA was born, and with it a division that assumed the work of overseeing Canadian NGOs. So by the mid-1970s, the OBC was almost entirely dependent for its funding on the NGO division of CETA. Aligned with the second wave of development thinking of the late 60s, Canadian NGOs were, according to Ted Kogan, shifting the narrative of development from, quote, portrayals of Western nations as benevolent, all-knowing, civilizing benefactors to focus on cooperation with the developing world. Alongside such shifts in developmentalist thinking, and similarly driven by anti-colonial activism, was a move in the 1970s away from the book donation model. I could say a lot about this, but I'm just going to give you one example. So driven by concerns of decolonizing nations regarding the gross imbalances of the emerging international communications order, UNESCO was by the 1960s sponsoring research on book publishing in the third world. Studies such as Ronald Barker and Richard Escarpet's The Book Hunger, published in 1973, for example, offer a frank assessment of the fact that book donations from the world's book-producing nations couldn't solve acute book shortages in Africa, because the greatest need was for books and languages not published in the producing nations. And there were other problems. It's clear that the OBC was not impervious to the shifting politics of development that characterized the period after 1965, even if, as an organization distanced from youth radicalism, it was somewhat slow to respond to this second wave. By the 1970s, the OBC was headquartered in Ottawa, first at 75 Spark Street, and later 323 Chapel Street, near where it still has its offices, and was encouraging the growth of mostly volunteer-run committees in cities across the country. The book donation program remained its central activity, as this promotional poster from the late 1960s or early 70s suggests. However, by the late 60s, the OBC was also expanding the range of educational aids it provided to include paper and mechanical equipment, and particularly paper. Slightly later, by the mid-1970s, an increasing sensitivity to questions about the appropriateness of donations emerged, and reports from then OBC Director W.A. Teeger's 11-Nation Tour of Africa in 1971 in archival papers of the International Adult Education Association, Council for Adult Education, suggest that this trip, Teeger's trip in 71 to Africa, really catalyzed this shift, questioning the appropriateness of particular kinds of book donations. So this reorientation of OBC activities intensified in the wake of a 1979 evaluation of the organization undertaken by the International Council for Adult Education, which KID served as Secretary General through the 1970s. The report's list of recommendations issuing from the context of the decade's global economic crisis and the growing disparity of wealth between affluent and impoverished nations focuses on growing local production capacity, Indigenous publishing, and low-cost printing initiatives. The 1982 renaming of OBC as the Canadian Organisation for Development and Education, l'Organisation canadienne pour l'éducation au service du développement, in the wake of the 1979 evaluation, was meant to reflect a new mode of operation, a shift from a supply-led to a recipient-led philosophy, as the June 1980 issue of Ngoma, the organization's newsletter in this period, indicates. The newsletter, this issue says, maybe it's time that the name should evolve along with our programs and become something which denotes education in the broader sense rather than focusing only on books. The book program is an important part of our activities, but OBC's support to Indigenous printing and literacy projects is increasing each year. Indeed, the name of the newsletter itself, Swahili for talking drum, invokes a mode of non-written communication proper to the societies of West Africa, and thus a concept of literacy that's local to these societies rather than to Europe or North America. That title is described in these issues. The movement away from book shipments is evident in the annual reports of the OBC in this period. So if almost 400 tons of books and equipment were shipped overseas in 1976-77, less than 200 were shipped in 1984. Nonetheless, as Code's records from the 1980s suggest, local book publishing remained a long-term goal that continued to rest on the recipient-led book donation model. So in closing, I'd like to pause on 2 points. First, Roby Kid's deepening awareness by the 1970s of the global inequalities that placed Canada in a very different position than the newly independent nations of Africa and the Caribbean. and also his growing conviction that this imbalance would not be righted through UNESCO. And second, the shifting economic and political context of this decade, which rendered Code's ambitions of the early 1980s unrealizable. So the common experience of colonialism that Kidd had evoked in speeches during the 1960s disappeared from his rhetoric as the complexities of third world decolonization came into full view during the global economic crisis of the 1970s. Moreover, Kidd seems to have become increasingly disenchanted after 1970 with UNESCO as a site for organizing globally around issues related to adult education. Despite his intense involvement with everything that was happening at UNESCO, especially related to literacy through the 60s and even into the 1970s. In the mid-1960s, as he agitated in educational journals for the possibility of a World Council on Adult Education, he observed that UNESCO was simply too broad to, quote, focus on any single field or respond quickly to demands, requests, and urgencies. In 1966, he wrote that a World Council for Adult Education would need to avoid domination by, quote, those of Anglo-Saxon origin or by Western Europe and North America. That he deemed such domination a constant and unavoidable threat at UNESCO is clear enough. The ties that Kidd retained to UNESCO through the 1970s, he was an evaluator, for example, of the Experimental World Literacy Program and a commentator on Canada's response to UNESCO's work on adult education through the 1970s, suggest his escalating frustration with the US and World Bank backed concept of functional literacy. So dependency theory and its critique of modernization theory confronted the resistance of both the United States and Britain in bodies such as UNESCO in the years that followed 1975. The New World Information and Communications Order generated policy that aimed to transform a global communications environment in which, as Richard Hogarth's 1978 commentary puts it, the flow of materials and opinions is massively one way. The eventual withdrawal of both Britain and the US, along with other nations from UNESCO in the 1980s, was a response to this politicization of media policy. In the same period, Canada neither withheld monetary support from UNESCO, as Britain and the US did in the 70s, nor withdrew its membership, but in the end, this didn't matter much. As Greg Donoghue demonstrates, the governments of Pierre Trudeau from 68 to 79, and again from 80 to 84, also played important leadership roles in the North-South dialogue that dominated international relations during the 1970s and the early 80s. Though Trudeau's desire to respond to discussions of the new international economic order at the UN General Assembly was hampered by a variety of domestic and international pressures: the slumping domestic economy, the separatist movement in Quebec, negative domestic media coverage of CETA, US recalcitrance, particularly after the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. That Code in this context found itself unable to launch a program that would transform the means of production of print materials in developing nations is hardly surprising. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. This is a really amazing project that you're undertaking here. And we do have some time for discussion and questions. I'll just invite any audience member. You can raise your hand by clicking on the little reactions icon at the bottom of your screen, or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question if we, oh, I see someone's got a hand up already, so I will call on, who am I calling on here? Julie, please.
Thank you. Hi, Jody.
Hi, Julie, how are you?
All right.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see you. And your talk was great. We had a dishwasher emergency here at the beginning of the talk, so we didn't hear the very beginning. So I wish to say one thing and I wish to ask one thing that you may have covered. So I'm sorry if I do that. I knew Roby Kidd because I worked in adult education before I went back to school.
Yeah.
He was a real god in adult education by this point, like really something. Like people would mention his name in hushed tones and everything. And I remember him as a benign elderly gentleman, but I didn't know as much about this particular phase of his career. So I really appreciate you talking about it.
Was this at OISE, Julie, that you knew?
No, I worked at the Center for Continuing Education at McMaster University, and I worked in literacy initiatives in Hamilton, Ontario. So Roby Kidd would be at all our conferences and would be part of our world, really. Like, you know, when he represented liberal values in education that were becoming operationalized at that time. So it was really, he was an important link to some other ways to think about literacy. So I really appreciate your talk for that. Because I don't think I realized all the background. I just knew who he was at the time. So my question would be, what happened after code? Like, you know, you really end your talk on code failed, you know, and for some really good reasons, actually, because of the way the development model wasn't going to be taken up and, you know, and other problems. And so what happened really once, like what happened with literacy and overseas policy in the later half of the 1980s under the Mulroney regime, and what actually occurred into the 80s and early 90s? I'd be really curious to know if there was any continuity or if the vision of Roby Kidd just fades out.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's you know, maybe I did end on sort of a negative note, but code continues, you know, and it exists today. It's in operation today. So it sort of limps along through the 1980s and 90s. And one of the ways that it reinvents itself ultimately is by becoming more involved in well, it develops, for example, and I'm not actually sure when this happens, but a series of book prizes. And I think that's the early 2000s that they, because of many that they received from a philanthropist named William Burt. And my colleague, Sarah Brouillette, who I'm not sure if she's here, has written about that a little bit in her new mini graph on African literature and underdevelopment on the code prizes. It's a very interesting thing. She got access to documents that Canadian writer judges had written up in visiting various Anglophone African nations to give these prizes to books. So this is one of the ways, prizing is one of the ways that Code attempts to kind of reinvent its model for educational development and literacy support in the present. And that's not really surprising, right? Prizing is a ubiquitous now mode of marketing. So that's one of the things that Code is doing in the present. It continues its other kinds of work. It has other developmental programs that continue in the present that I'd like to keep working on. But really what I think is more generally true is that this model of kind of this idea of developmentalism and literature is one that persists, right, through even past the long downturn of the 1970s. This idea that literacy books and a particular model of a particular kind of literacy is valuable, or remains one that's really an important part of any NGO work that's linked to books in the present. And this the whole idea of the liberal selfhood that's nourished through books and so on, and the productive capacities of the individual, the aspirational culture that's linked to books, all of these Western ideas about books that are much older than the period I'm looking at, certainly, of course, remain, I think, in many ways in book development in the present, despite other kinds of changes.
Yeah, thank you. That's really fascinating. I hope to see more of this work out there.
Thanks, Julie.
I wondered, Jody, if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to this project, particularly, you know, through other research you've done on local literacy initiatives, and what the relationships are between local literacy projects like Frontier College, for example, and these overseas initiatives, because obviously they're pretty connected, but
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So yeah, I mean, I learned about Roby Kidd from reading about the history of education in Canada. You can't, as Julie's suggesting, you can't open a book, you can begin smelling any of these books or articles without being overwhelmed by Roby Kidd's presence. He was a massive influence, and so when I started to think about, when I wrote the book Home Feelings, I was working with the archive, the Frontier College Archives at Library and Archives Canada, and it's a huge archive. And so just for practical purposes, I realized I had to focus on a very small period. That book ends around the end of the Second World War. And I, in the conclusion to that book, I talk a little bit about, what sort of happens to literacy. What is the importance of the relationship between the early pedagogies of citizenship that were developed in Canada's early literacy movements, Frontier College in particular, and post-war conceptions of literacy that are developed at the level of the state. And the other piece of that, that could have been another whole study is then where liberal internationalists like Roby Kidd take this idea, this model, this idea that that to develop individuals, we need to give them books, and that becomes the sort of cornerstone of his philosophy of international development. And he, the reason he's so important partly is because he feels that it's crucial to take Canada's example. Well, the reason I find him so compelling and interesting and contradictory is because he feels that it's crucial to take Canada's success in its domestic experiments to an international context, and therefore has, I think, quite a remarkable influence on what's happening in international education movements in this period, and it means then that Canada has a quite, for its size and its political importance, geopolitical importance, has a rather oversized influence on some of these conversations that are happening after the Second World War. Anyway, those are some of the connections, how I came across Roby Kidd and so on, and how it's connected to the earlier work.
Thank you. I see a couple of questions. One in the chat from Kyle, who talks about learning in their book history class that Francophone Quebec literature boomed post World War II, and while all the printing facilities in Europe were diminished due to World War II destruction. So Kyle wonders, did OBC have a 50-50 split in language?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kyle. No, you're absolutely right. And of course, so there's some great work. José Vincent and my partner Eli McLaren have written a great article that sort of sums up a lot of that what's happening. Why it is that Quebec has this boom of its own much earlier than happens in English Canada. The OBC, despite being an officially bilingual association, was very much an Anglophone thing. I mean, I think you get that from my talk. It had a bilingual name, but it did have offices in Montreal and other parts of Quebec, mostly Montreal, and it had volunteers in Quebec, but they were mostly Anglophones, and they collected books. They didn't curate books. So this is another thing that really distinguishes a program like the OBC and later Code from earlier state book development programs. So there were also, the Government of Canada also had book development programs through the 50s and 60s, some of which were linked to the Colombo Plan, for example. And those were highly curated, as you might imagine, right? There was a whole bureaucracy in external affairs, the information division, that was selecting books to go overseas in the context of a program called the Canadiana program that I've written about in Canadian literature. They were collecting books, that would represent both Anglophone and Francophone Canada, and a very particular version of settler nationhood that was being sent overseas. The Colombo Plan books was a little bit different, more of a Cold War kind of book program. But the OBC didn't curate its books. So they did have some Francophone books, and they did attempt to make connections with the countries of Francophone Africa in particular and the Francophone Caribbean. But there was by no means any kind of curation of the books that they sent. They sent what they received.
Thank you. There's a question from David. Go ahead, David.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Jody, for the talk. It was great to be able to hear more about what you're working on right now. I'm wondering if you're able to speak at all to Roby Kids' connections with the Indian Eskimo Association of Canada in the 60s, and to what extent, if any, there are references to this kind of program in terms of kind of, shall we say, in an internal colonization context. You know, obviously, a lot of what Kid is talking about in the 60s is taking place against the backdrop of the Hawthorne Report. So I'm just wondering, you know, maybe to get at kind of some of the tensions that you're saying that Kid was trying to navigate, whether he engaged with that at all in terms of his links with or contacts with Indigenous peoples in the same period.
Yeah, well, David, I'm so glad you came, because it's, you know, as I've communicated to you, your work is really helpful to me for thinking about that. You use that phrase internal colonization and just some of the contradictions of that I'm trying to kind of pull out in this particular case, the OBC. But as I mentioned to you in my earlier communication with you, you know, the book development paradigm, I think a really fascinating case for looking at some of the contradictions, like what's happening domestically with internal colonization, would be things like Books for the North programs that are a huge part of the book development paradigm in Canada. However, I know nothing about Roby Kids' involvement with the Indian Eskimo Association. I'd love to know more. Maybe you can tell me.
I'm wanting to find out some more myself.
I will find out. I haven't yet had a chance to look at Kids' papers at the Archives of Ontario. So the papers I'm working with now are all the papers from the International Council of Adult Education at LAC.
Right.
But Kids' papers, his own papers, I think will tell me a lot more.
And I think there would be stuff also in the archives at Trent. And I mean, the Books of the North program, I'd be curious to learn more about as well, because I think, I mean, you can see the, what do you want to call it, the pedagogical dimension of these kinds of development projects. And anyway, I find it a fascinating case study that you're exploring. So thank you.
Thanks. I hope we can talk more. I also saw in the chat, Dominique, thank you, put a link to the aidhistory.ca, which is the wonderful website that she runs, Historians of Humanitarian Aid, and then a link to some new histories of diplomacy, including many QSO people breaking barriers, shaping worlds. Just wanted to point that out. It's up at the top of the chat.
I can see a few things, but I don't know how many other questions there are before. Sarah?
I think you can go ahead. Sure.
This is all marvelous, Jody, and I was about to ask the same question as David, so that's bad for you, David. But the one of the things that is interesting is, first of all, I recognize so much in his way of speaking about Canada unproblematically, you know, about Indigenous, the relationship, you know, not a colonial nation. Yeah. The way that the engineers that Jill Campbell Miller is studying, like the same Canadian engineers who went to India, were doing stuff in the Yukon. And they were talking exactly like Bruce Kidd, you know, we're no problem. And so then what's interesting is they I think is Bruce Kidd's, this is my question, Bruce Kidd's relationship with the civil society, because organizations like Oxfam at the time, like 61 and all that, civil society education, and even some of the people who were associated with the adult education movements that David was talking about, who were not in the middle of these UNESCO more state-centered relations, they were critical of these things. They were already saying a lot of the things that we're saying now about them. And I was wondering about the relationship between Bruce Kidd, which people like this were seen by people in Oxfam as old hat, you know, old people with older views of the possibilities of development in the 60s. So have you come across these contemporary criticisms?
No, and so J.R. Kidd, you mean, right? The Roby Kidd, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, you're right? So the founders of OBC were all, as I'm pointing out, born right around the First World War. And so by the 1960s, I'm sure they did look very old. And even the OBC, you know, so it's fascinating to read some of the records from the annual reports and executive internal memos and so on from the early 60s, where there's a real sense that the OBC has to kind of catch up, right? And it takes until the early 1970s even for the OBC to be responding in any kind of meaningful way to questions that were circulating much earlier in sort of second wave development discourse, questions about you know, local production capacity or appropriateness of donations. It's not until the early 1970s that this happens. In terms of kind of civil society organizations that are opposed to or critical of these more state-centered structures that Kidd was involved in, I'm not really sure. I mean, the example that I would think of would be something like Frontier College, which was in this period. I don't really know what they were doing in relation to, that's a fascinating question though, right? What were they doing in relation to UNESCO's literacy work through the 60s and 70s? I don't know, in fact. Yeah.
Just a final comment. I really like your biographical approach, because when you see how he was influenced by missionaries, and how is his being in, you know, the Kenya Kuso things, and how these individual ways by which these histories of development are linked to each other. And I'm sure you have a lot of stuff as well on how in Canada people of many global South diasporas are getting involved in all this. So it's really, really a nice approach to do it around someone.
Yeah, thanks. And you know, it's hugely the whole at Roby Kidd's, there's his history, but then Frontier College has this whole history in the social gospel movement. This is part of the history of the literacy movement in Canada, of adult education more generally. Yeah. Thank you, Dominique.
Jody, did you see the comment from Sarah Brouillette in the chat as well?
Right. Okay. So just wanted to note that Code's book prizing program, the Code Burt Literary Awards, has lost its funding. Right. So it's now finished as of last year. Burt's heirs are running his foundation now and taking a different direction. Wilderness. Oh, I didn't know wilderness conservation. That's interesting. Yes, I saw that. So they're no longer running that prize, which they transformed. It was a prize originally for young adult fiction in Anglophone African nations, and then it became a prize. There's another interesting turn for Métis and Indigenous authored young adult fiction. So Sherry DeMoline's The Marrow Thieves, for example, won.
And Dominique,
thank you, Sam.
Adds anything about books in Braille?
In Braille, no, not that I encountered. No, I mean, there were whole programs devoted to just medical textbooks, and well, in particular, and in that particular program was associated with the Colombo Plan, but no, I didn't encounter anything.
And another question has popped in from Jenna Jarvis.
Jenna.
First slide was the first edition, first print rendering of Anansi, as an Anansi
Right.
with the E, a typographical error or Godfrey's preference?
Yeah, it's a good question, Janet. No, they hadn't decided yet in that period. So it's spelled all many different ways in that first year. And then they settled on Anansi with an I. Yeah, it's a good question. Good editor's eye you have.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Any other final questions or comments?
I like your just one little thing. You think about communism and the fear of education and communism. Anything that I might have missed about books? You don't send books that are dangerous, like pornography or something like that. Any kind of censorship there?
Yeah, with the OBC, nothing in the records that I found so far. Of course, this is a huge part of the state-sponsored book donation programs in the same period. So the Canadiana program that was launched by the Department of External Affairs in 46, and it's a related program for a book donation program linked to the Colombo plan. They were much more, the information division was charged with selecting and choosing titles that would be appropriate. So in the case of the Colombo plan book program, it was short-lived, just the late 50s. And the bureaucrats who were choosing those titles were attempting to just choose titles that were things that were titles that promoted the ideals of liberal democracy and so on. And there's fascinating work on this, similar programs in the US where, for example, similar programs in the US. And the Canadian case was just really, in many ways, a kind of copycat of those US programs. So many of the books were doubled on the Canadian lists that were sent out by USAID in the same period. So books to fight communism, essentially. Yeah.
Amazing stuff. This is such fascinating history. Jody, thank you so much for this this really interesting glimpse into the work that you're doing, and I look forward to seeing it come to fruition.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for your time. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you everybody. Thanks to the CLC staff for helping to organize this event, and thank you so much, Jody, for delivering the scholarly lecture this year. It was such a pleasure. And I wish you all a very happy weekend.
Yes, it's Friday.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I'm just wondering, Kyle, hi, you had a question in the chat. I don't know, do you want to, maybe you want to go?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, if you have a sec, just anything you came across during the study that of any of the local communities that were successful after the code progress?
Of supporting local community printing and publishing in the later efforts you described. Well, the only thing is, so Code really got into a paper donation program in the 70s. And also purchasing printing equipment that they would then ship abroad. So trying to encourage local printing operations. But, what I'm trying to sort of imply in so the paper thing was huge because in Africa, the African nations, paper shortages were an incredible problem through the 70s. And so Code was trying to respond to that. But, essentially the larger kind of, there's such a huge, the global geopolitical context of this period means that anything that Code is doing is being actively undermined by essentially a global communications order that is consolidating all wealth and power in the Anglo-American British publishing industries. So, copyright, the legal regimes of copyright, and so code doesn't, not much that it can do. It's doing its best. And of course, decolonizing nations in this period in Africa and other places are beginning to insist, if you want to come with your development money, well, then the books will need to be printed here. And we want to own ourselves printing. This happened in Nigeria, for example. We want to own printing facilities, but this was a small piece. Of course, what happens in this period is that publishing in the UK and in the United States, these companies just get bigger and bigger and bigger after 1950, right? And power is consolidated quite readily by the end of the 20th century.
Great, thank you. I'm just taking book history here at the University of Alberta, so.
Oh yeah, great. Okay, super. Yeah, you guys have lots of those courses. That's great.
That was a great question, Kyle. I was wondering the same thing actually. So thank you for asking that.